Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture about government intervention and international trade. I am David Smerdon. Before we get into this week's content, let's first have a few exercises to just get our thinking caps on with some of the topics we've seen in recent weeks, particularly putting supply and demand together. Let's take this example. Suppose the government has always offered subsidies to domestic car manufacturers and to public transport providers. And then government constraints suddenly force the removal of both of these subsidies. Now, based on this, government action in the two markets try to use the supply and demand model and our equilibrium analysis to predict what will happen in the short run to the supply of cars, the supply of public transport services, the price of public transport, the quantity used of public transport, the quantity demanded of cars, the demand for cars, the new market clearing price of cars, and the quantity of cars demanded after the subsidies are removed. Now, those are a lot of questions. You'd want to draw graphs that look like this. I will leave you to think about this. So pause this video now and then we'll come back and look at the answers. Okay, so when these subsidies are removed, essentially what's happened is an increase in the input costs for the suppliers. And we know that an increase in the input costs is going to shift the supply curve to the left. So if we take our curves, what we would expect is the supply curve for cars to shift to the left and the supply curve for public transport to shift to the left as well. And that should help us to answer at least the first couple of questions relatively easily. So what do we expect to happen to the supply of cars? Well, we can see from our graph it's going to fall, and that makes sense because they're more expensive to make. And we can see that by looking at how the equilibrium point has changed. So it's now going to be less than the original Q star. And this is going to be the same for both of these markets from our initial analysis. So that also tells us that the supply of public transport services should fall. Sorry, those are the actual supply curves moving to the left. And that results in the price of public transport rising if demand is assumed to be fixed, the quantity used of public transport to decrease. These are at the equilibrium points now for C, D, and E, whereas A and B was just about shifting the curves. Quantity of demanded of cars will decrease as the price rises in the short run. The demand for cars, now this is interesting. The demand for cars, we would expect this to increase a little since it's a substitute for public transport, and public transport has become a little bit cheaper. Now, that's the assumption that you're going to have to make if you want to make this claim. But what that means is that, well, I'll show you in a slide or two. Well, I can show you now, actually. So we would actually expect the demand for cars to shift to the right because public transport has become a bit more expensive. What that means, when you put that into play as well, you'll see that the new market clearing price for cars will definitely rise because the supply curve has shifted to the left and the demand curve has shifted to the right. On the other hand, the quantity of cars demanded in the long run is not clear because you've got these two effects moving against each other. So it depends on the magnitude of the supply and demand curve shifts, how far they go, and also what their elasticities were beforehand as well. Okay. So what we're going to look at today is about government intervention and how this relates to the free market. Now, I'll put up another supplement to this lecture, which will be about how the economics of government intervention and about free markets in general relates to political orientation. So we'll talk about the left side of politics, the right side of politics, and how this relates both to economic freedom and to personal freedom, to give you some idea of where the left-right divide in politics came from in the first place. And also, this is a time in your lives where you are coming to terms with where your values lie, and probably developing or fine-tuning your own personal political orientation, which you'll need as soon as the student elections kick off again. Economics can help guide you there, because the parts of this course, the elements of this course that you find most convincing, most unconvincing, the ones that you find equitable or not equitable, that will sort of help you to work out where you sit on terms of the political compass. So the relationship between governments and the free market talks to a debate between efficiency and equity. So we've learned that market equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market is efficient, in the sense that all of the mutually beneficial trades have been carried out between buyers and sellers. We cannot do any better with those who are not in the market. We cannot make anyone better off without somebody else becoming worse off. But it doesn't talk about who those people are who we make better off, and that's the element of equity. So competitive markets maximize the economic surplus for society as a whole, but obviously any individual consumer would like to pay less, and any individual supplier would like to charge more. And some people are going to be more disadvantaged than others, and this leads to opportunities and incentives, in fact, for different industries and different interest groups to lobby governments to intervene into the market. Now, according to the theories that we've seen so far, which have been adopted by at least one side of the political economic landscape, those who believe in free markets, if you lobby and pressure governments to intervene, this should lead to a move away from this equilibrium price that we've seen is the best that our market can do. So that will move us away from the equilibrium price and quantity, which must lead to an economic inefficiency, which we will call a dead weight loss. That is a reduction in the total surplus to society. And so what we're going to look at this week, in terms of particularly the negative side of government intervention, that's generally associated with the right side of politics. More conservative governments, less interested in government interventions, more pro-capitalism and so forth. In subsequent weeks, we will look at how economic theories, which other economic theories actually speak to the other side of politics, and situations where this logical flow that you see on the screen doesn't always hold. Okay, so what is this dead weight loss? Well, it's a loss of economic surplus due to the market being prevented of reaching this equilibrium point that we've seen as the most efficient point, and that's a point where the marginal benefit equates to the marginal cost. If we think in terms of our graph that we've become reasonably familiar with now, we can see that the total surplus that we had before was made up of all of these colored shapes, essentially, if we're at this equilibrium point. So above this dotted line and going up to the triangle, A plus B plus C, that's the consumer surplus. And below that dotted line, D plus E, that's that producer surplus. Now, if we were in a situation where the market was not in its competitive equilibrium, for example, the price was not at $2, but say at $2.20, then we know that at this higher price, suppliers would love to be able to sell more, but they're not going to find enough buyers. In fact, the buyers sort of limit the quantity traded in the market. We'll only have, in this example, 14,000 rather than 15,000 cups of coffee sold per week. So that's going to be the equilibrium quantity, 14,000, for a price of $2.20. It's going to lead to a much smaller consumer surplus, A, the producer surplus has actually changed shape and may even have grown a little bit now. It's D plus B rather than D plus E. But what about this C plus E? Well, before that was a welfare gain, that was a surplus, and now it just doesn't exist anymore because there's no trade happening past the 14,000 cups point. So this is kind of like surplus that's lost to society, and we call that the deadweight loss, C plus E, which is a measure of the inefficiency that comes about from this price being off the equilibrium or competitive market price. Now notice that the producers might actually be better off in this example. The consumers are definitely worse off. It is possible for one side of the market to be better off from government intervention. But overall, we can definitely say that the total surplus has decreased. By the way, when we talk about producer surplus, we're not talking about profit. What we're talking about is almost an abstract concept. It's about welfare in the sense that it's the difference between what producers would have been willing to supply a good for and the price that they actually receive. So it's a measure of welfare, or in other words, what's the benefit to this group of society from being able to participate as opposed to not being able to participate. Profit, on the other hand, is the difference between total revenue and total costs, and it's much more of an accounting measure. So how can governments intervene in the market? Well, there are 5 main tools that they can use, although some of them are quite similar in fact, but we'll mention these 5 separately and do our examples accordingly. They are price ceilings, price floors, taxes, import quotas, and tariffs. Those latter two are typically talking about international trade. So when, when international sellers come into the market, for example. So when a government chooses to intervene and set a price, it can set a price that's lower than the market clearing price, and that will typically be done by imposing a price ceiling that sellers can't go above a certain price, or they can try to set prices that are higher than the market clearing price, and they can typically do that by setting a price floor. Sellers must sell. Sellers cannot sell below a certain amount. Let's start with the price ceiling. It represents the maximum allowable price imposed by the government, and is usually done when it believes that the price is unfair and is disadvantaging low-income consumers. It's something we've actually seen a bit of during the COVID period, where the government has noticed a massive surge in price due to a massive surge in demand for certain goods such as hand sanitizer, toilet paper, and so forth. And the government has tried to, in some places, the government has tried to impose a price ceiling on this. A more regular and traditional example has got to do with the rental market, and in particular, placing a ceiling on rents to help out consumers, which has been tried in, for example, famously in New York and also in San Francisco. But there can be unintended consequences to doing this. So let's say, for example, that the market price was $100 and the market ceiling imposed was $80. Well, on the left, we can sort of see this, this equilibrium point here at $100, and then we can sort of get a sense of what's happening if we impose a ceiling of $80. Now at $80, that's obviously going to be great news for the renters, and many more are going to want to enter the market. But those consumers are not going to be able to rent because of the effect on supply from that decreased price. So now only QS is willing to be supplied, and we can see that this is essentially cut off a small triangle from that big triangle before that was the total surplus to the society. Now, of course, for a price ceiling to be binding, it must be that that ceiling is below what the market price is. If it's set above, for example, if the government set a price ceiling of $120, but rents were going for $100 a week, well, it just wouldn't have any effect. So this triangle that's now cut out of the total surplus, that's the deadweight loss to society. So that's the inefficiency. However, notice that there has also been a reweighting of the relative surplus to producers and to consumers. This new yellow triangle A prime represents the new consumer surplus, and that may well be larger than the old consumer surplus A. So that's a bit ambiguous, the effect on consumers, but for sure we can see that C prime is less than C, so producers have definitely lost. So who are the winners of this policy? Well, those are the consumers with a high reservation price, those that have a high willingness to pay. If you remember, if we look at the previous graph, when we think about our demand curve, remember when we had five buyers in a market, for example, we had buyer 1 over here representing his willingness to pay. So when the price was really high, we only had one buyer willing to be in the market. He was up here. And then you had the second buyer, the third buyer, decreasing in order of their willingness to pay. But who are the ones in society who have this highest willingness to pay? Well, those are the rich. So we can see that the part of the supply that's now missing, those consumers who were in the market here on the left panel but are no longer in the market on the right panel, are the poorer ones. It's the rich who are still in the market, and they're the ones who are capturing this increase in the consumer surplus. So if the goal is to help consumers as a whole, as a group, this policy might make sense. But if the goal is to help the low-income households, the ones who are being negatively affected in the first place, then this is not actually the best solution. A better solution would be to, instead of imposing these sort of price restrictions, to do a direct lump sum transfer that is means tested or income tested. Now, the analysis for a price floor is very similar, but why would you ever want to have a higher price if you're a government? Well, that could be a situation where your producers are negatively affected and you really want to do something about them. For example, Australian wool farmers or dairy farmers, or in situations when the suppliers are actually workers. So they're supplying their labor, as you will be doing when you enter the workforce. And in that case, you may want to set a higher price in terms of minimum wages. We can again use the same supply and demand model to analyze this. So the definition of a price floor, it represents the minimum allowable price imposed by the government. And I realize I am putting my head a little bit over the screen there, so let me reduce my fat head for a second. So this is a situation where the government believes that the price is unfair. I'm not having a good technological day today. Where the government believes that the price is unfairly low to protect producers in a certain sector. And like I said, that could be the labour sector as a whole in the case of minimum wages. So let's see this on the graph again. Again, it's a little bit of a colourful graph, as you can see, but but you can also find more details about this in your textbook. So do check that out. So again, if we want the price floor to have an effect, it must be above the market price. If the market price is $100 and the government orders suppliers to be selling for more than $80, well, they're already doing that, so it doesn't bite. And here we can see just the mirror image essentially of what we saw before in the case of a price ceiling. So setting a price floor of $120 here really encourages suppliers to want to supply more in the market, but they're again constrained, and they're constrained by the demand curve. You can think about it as when you set the new price, which of the supply and demand curves do you hit first if you move horizontally along from that price? Well, here we hit the demand curve. that limits the quantity that's traded in the market. And we can see that the consumer surplus, A prime, is way smaller than it was before. But that producer surplus has actually grown. So C prime is bigger. So we've helped those consumers in the market. We've actually helped those who had a lower willingness to accept in the first place. So again, there are questions about whether this is the most efficient way to help the struggling producers in whatever market we're trying to help. And again, we have this sort of triangle cut out, the shaded region, which is the deadweight loss. So that's the overall decrease in efficiency or decrease in total surplus as a result of this action. And we can see that by adding things up here, we can see that the total surplus was A plus B plus C, and now we're down to A prime plus C prime. So the losers of this policy are all those who are harmed by the price floor, definitely the consumers, but also the producers to some extent, particularly those who had higher willingness to accept or essentially higher marginal costs, which are going to be those smaller producers. So one solution to fix this would be that the losers of this policy, if it were enacted, would be willing to pay the winners the exact amount that they gained from the intervention in exchange for this price floor not going ahead. And that would be a situation where everyone is better off than if the price floor was put in place. So that would be a Pareto improving transaction. And the reason that that's possible, that both sides can win, is because this deadweight loss can be avoided. But this actually happens when price floors or price ceilings are imposed. The losers do actually go to the winners and offer to pay them more in exchange for not having to follow by the government rules. And how do they do this? Well, that is exactly what we call a black market. So putting in place price ceilings and price floors actually encourages people to trade with each other in such a way as to avoid these restrictions at prices that violate what the government has been trying to put in place. And that's exactly what a black market is. So overall, the summary then from price floor and price ceilings is that some people will win, some people will lose, but overall there will be a loss of economic efficiency, which is often quite large, in addition to the fact that it encourages black markets to arise. This is something I spoke about in a recent supplement, and this is talking about the applications of economics and in particular positive versus normative analysis. So positive analysis is saying what will happen if we put something in place, how big the gains to the winners are, how big the losses to the losers are. But normative analysis is something we should try to avoid in economics. Again, that word norm coming from social norm, meaning what should happen, what ought to happen, what's the right thing to do. Economists should not try to speak to this sort of stuff, but just talk very much to the black and white of, or essentially the numbers. So in this case, for example, New York and San Francisco have kept these sort of price ceilings on rents for a long period of time, which has led to a shortage and has led to various black market sort of things. We're seeing some sort of black market rental behavior happening in the Sydney market at the moment as well. Whether or not the decline in economic efficiency is worth it or not is not something that we should say as economists. So that's not strictly an economic question. There's politics involved in that. There's questions of equity. What we can say is that if your outcome is to benefit low-income renters, and you have a lot of low-income renters who are struggling, then overall this government transfer that's being tested is probably going to be a better use of your money than putting these sort of controls in place, price controls. Okay. A third option that's quite popular is taxation. And unlike a price ceiling or a price floor, taxes actually grab some of the surplus gains in our market that can be used as tax revenue. And tax revenue can be used to benefit society, benefit different parts of society who need help, to redistribute wealth within a society from rich to poor. And that can really help to improve the distribution of income and opportunities across different population groups. For example, if you particularly wanted to help low-income households and low-income renters. Taxes in theory can be used for many welfare gains by financing government activities. On the other hand, though, when you put taxes in place into a competitive market, once again, you are going to affect the gains that come about from the invisible hand and from free market activities, which will result in a decline in economic efficiency. In fact, they reduce the consumer surplus and the producer surplus and result in a deadweight loss. And they also lead to less of those goods and services being traded than otherwise would be in the economy. And this is again part of the motivation for that right or conservative side of politics, saying governments should not intervene in the markets, there's no role for big government, and you pay too much tax. So let's look at an example of taxation. We'll start with the tax on producers. Now we know that the supply curve is meant to represent the marginal cost for a large part of the individual supply curve, at least for those suppliers. But now there's a situation where that marginal cost, the cost of producing an item, has to take into account that extra unit tax that's being added on. So essentially, at every point where you produce the kth good or the nth good, so for example here the sixth good, before the marginal cost was here, and that gives us the price. But now we have to add on that tax. So it's exactly a vertical increase in the supply curve by that amount of the tax. Now, if we were to tax producers, who bears the burden? Who is going to be disadvantaged from adding in the tax? You might naturally assume that it's going to be the suppliers, the producers. But actually, let's look at an example. So on the left, we've got the competitive market outcome. On the right, we see what happens where we add in the tax per unit. So remember, that's a vertical increase in the supply curve, a tax per unit. And when we do that, we see that the equilibrium point has shifted to here now. So this is the new price given the tax, the new quantity given the tax. There's again a dead weight loss to society. The tax revenue is going to be equal to the tax per unit, times the number of units. So it's exactly equal to this revenue here. So this pink box is equal to the tax revenue. But notice that both the producer surplus and the consumer surplus have decreased. So the burden of the tax has actually been shared here by both the consumers and the producers, even though the tax was applied just to the producers. So the losers of this policy are both the producers and the consumers. However, who loses more and by how much depends on the elasticities of those curves, of the demand and the supply curves. For example, if demand is perfectly inelastic, that's a situation where consumers don't have the flexibility or responsiveness to adapt to this changing situation with the tax. And then the consumers will actually bear more of the burden. On the other hand, if the producers have supply curves that are inelastic, then the producers will be the bigger losers of this policy. There is another side here, and that is the government. So the government is earning this T region, this tax revenue region here. So that's the big winner, and of course that revenue can be used in various ways, and if you trust your government, then it will be used in welfare increasing ways. However, overall, there is still a deadweight loss to society. One solution, or a different approach that could be put in place, is for the losers to be willing to pay, again, the winner, the government here, the exact amount it gained from this intervention in exchange for cancelling the tax. And in this situation, again, it would be a Pareto improving transaction. Both the government, the consumers, and the producers would all be better off. And the way that that's possible, again, is by removing this deadweight loss. Okay, so we know that the winner is the government, and it can use this tax revenue in different ways. It can subsidize other markets, reduce taxes in other markets, provide public goods like public transport and so forth. But let's think about, what if governments say we are going to tax no matter what, regardless of the deadweight loss? What's the most efficient way of collecting tax revenues? Well, if that's the question that economists are given and that's all they have to work with, then the answer is to tax those with the lowest elasticity. That is, the ones that are most inelastic. And the reason for that is because if you tax ones with more elastic supply and demand, you'll end up with a bigger deadweight loss. So let's see an example of this. On the left, we've got a situation where we're taxing the producers by the same vertical distance, so that's the same tax per unit, for very elastic supply. What we see is that the tax revenue is this square here, and the deadweight loss is this reasonably large triangle here. Now let's look on the right, a situation where we've got inelastic supply. Notice that the vertical distance, the marginal tax on each unit is exactly the same in both. So where the government's imposing the same per unit tax in both situations, it's just that in this market the supply is inelastic. Well, now at this new point, quantity hasn't decreased by much. The tax revenue is very large and the deadweight loss is very small. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the suppliers in the left are able to adjust. They are elastic, they are more responsive and sensitive, so they can dramatically scale back their supply. The more that they scale back their supply, the bigger that deadweight loss is going to be, and the less income there is for governments. And that's a problem that many governments actually make when they predict how much tax revenue they'll get from a certain tax. They only really take into account, a lot of the time, the current supply that's out there in the market and the current quantity that's being traded. But they need to take into account what the equilibrium effect on supply is going to be, because that can dramatically change the amount of revenue they predict they'll get versus the amount of revenue they actually get. So we can see in this example that it's much more efficient for a government who wants to gain tax revenue to apply it to the least elastic market. And we've seen some examples already of this. For example, on the case of tampons, but also other markets where demand or supply are particularly inelastic. An example of this is beer. Now, Australia recently hiked the tax rate on beer now, such that if you buy a carton of or a slab, as they call it, of say carton beer, almost $20 of that is now going towards tax, sort of an outrageous amount. Australians pay the 4th highest beer tax in the world. Interesting question. What do you think the other 3 are? Well, they are also countries with extremely high demand for beer, in a sense, and you may well know, if you're from Scandinavia, that beer prices are quite excessive there. And Japan is the other one that sits there above Australia. So the increase now is such that up to 42% of the cost of a carton of full-strength beer can be made up by taxes in Australia. So if I was to ask you, is the Australian demand for beer elastic or inelastic? Well, it doesn't take a genius to work this out, particularly given what's happened to the run in the stores of Dan Murphy's since COVID's taken place. The demand for beer is very inelastic. The question of who is burdened by a tax is very interesting and important And this is something that sort of comes as a bit of a surprise, particularly when learning about this for the first time. And that is that who actually pays the tax, or who is burdened most with it, depends on the slope of the demand curve and the price elasticity of demand. Notice that these two things are related but not exactly the same. And the slope of the supply curve and the price elasticity of supply. But it doesn't depend on whether the government imposes that tax onto producers or onto consumers. And that's something that's kind of strange. The government can put that same tax onto either the buyers or the sellers, but the burden will still be the same in equilibrium. Let's see how that actually works. Imagine that we're looking at the petrol market, and we'll put a tax on the sellers. So we'll put a tax on the sellers such that we've increased the marginal cost per unit to supply that unit, which has shifted the supply curve to the left, but it's easier to think about it in terms of shifting it up by a certain amount. So this is a 40 cents per litre excise tax, which will shift up the supply curve by exactly 40 cents. So this supply curve going from any given quantity up to the new line is 40 cents. But that won't shift the equilibrium price by 40 cents, because that equilibrium price will be a little bit moved to the left, as we know. So in this case, the price that consumers will pay afterwards is now $1.45 instead of $1.10, and the quantity is decreased from 150 million litres per year to 140 million litres. The price that the sellers receive after being paid $1.45 per litre, they've still got to pay that 40 cents to the government. So they only receive $1.05 per litre. So this is the amount of money that the sellers actually receive per litre. This is the amount that the buyers sell. And obviously that sort of big rectangle in there, that's going to be the tax revenue. Notice that the change from $1.10, which was the buying and selling price before, has been much bigger for the consumers than for the producers. And we can get some sort of intuition why that is when we look at the steepness of the demand curve versus the supply curves. So definitely demand is more inelastic in this case, which is also quite realistic for the petrol market. What happens if we impose the same tax now onto the buyers? Well, it's again a 40 cent per litre excise tax on petrol, and that means that at every quantity the demand curve now has to be lower by 40 cents. So even though we've shifted it to the left, it's easier to think about it as shifting down by exactly 40 cents. When that happens, we get a new equilibrium point, but at this new equilibrium point, the quantity has decreased by exactly the same amount, down to 140 million litres. The price now that the sellers of petrol receive is going to be $1.05. That's going to be the exchange that happens at the petrol station, and the buyers are going to have to pay an extra 40 cents. So the overall amount that the buyers are going to pay is $1.45. So we can see that actually the equilibrium price and quantity that effectively the buyers and sellers pay is going to be the same, whether or not we impose the tax onto the buyers or onto the sellers. And in both cases, the market deadweight loss is exactly the same as well. A couple of weeks ago, we spoke about tampons and how it's taken 18 years for the GST exemption to be given to tampons as an essential good, even though there were exemptions before for condoms and for razor blades. There aren't really good moral or social reasons for why tampons were taxed, but we can think of some economic reasons in the fact that the demand for these products was is highly inelastic. A terrible pun that the demand for condoms is more elastic, but realistically it is more elastic. There are more substitutes rather than for female sanitary items. And that meant that there were chances for the government to actually earn more tax revenue by taxing tampons than for these other goods. And yes, believe it or not, I found this cartoon online. It does actually exist. I have no idea what the connection is. So what are the products that are taxed heavily in Australia? And can we see a relationship between those and elasticity? Or what about for China? What are the different sort of goods? Well, there are the same sort of goods overall for most countries that are taxed heavily. And in Australia, beer, I've spoken about, cigarettes, luxury cars, fuel. Fuel's an example which, as we've seen, has very inelastic demand. And gambling. Now, what sort of people pay these taxes? Well, for luxury cars, the argument is these are the richer, they can afford it, so we can do that. But when we think about things like alcohol, for example, and we think about it in terms of the percentage spent on alcohol as a share of your gross household income, actually the poorest people in Australia are spending more as a share on alcohol than the richest. Now, there are various reasons why this could be, and there are some confounding factors, but overall it could be seen that these sort of taxes have a particularly damaging effect on the consumer surplus for the poorer in Australia. What about if we think about taxes in China? For those of you who are familiar with taxes in China, you might know some of these categories already. Some of them are similar to Australia. But have a think, have a bit of a guess. What do you think are those different products that are taxed more heavily in China? Well, the usual suspects appear: alcohol, cigarettes, fuel. Cars also there to some extent, but there are also some interesting ones. Cosmetics with a 30% tax, skincare and healthcare products, fireworks and firecrackers, and precious jewelry, particularly pearls and jade. And interestingly, motorcycles have a higher tax than cars. And again, we can get some sort of idea of where this is coming from when we think about why there might be more inelastic demand for some of these sort of products within different societies. What about in the US? Well, the US in general is very similar to Australia and to most Western democracies in terms of alcohol, luxury cars, gambling, cigarettes, and so forth. However, just in terms of things that might set the US apart from other countries to some extent, recently a lawmaker in Arizona pushed for a pornography tax to pay for Trump's border wall. And given the amount that it costs to pay for this wall, we would have to hope that there was very inelastic demand in the US. All right, let's see another example of how these taxes work in action on our supply and demand curves. Let's look at the effects of a tax on the market for cigarettes. And again, what we'll do is we'll put the tax on the supply side. So we'll increase that supply curve. We'll say if it's a $1 tax, can you work out how that supply curve shifts? Well, for every point on the original supply curve, the new supply curve must be exactly $1 higher. So we've increased things, we've shifted up the curve by exactly $1. Notice here again that the demand curve is relatively steep because demand for cigarettes, an addictive product, is going to be quite inelastic. What that means is that the consumers are the ones who share most of the burden. Again, there's been a small decrease in the quantity supplied, but for consumers, they'll see the price go up by 90 cents out of that $1, whereas for suppliers, they're receiving an effective price of $1.90. So that's a decrease in 10 cents from what they were getting before. And that deadweight loss is going to be the triangle that's made up of points A, B, and C. What about the tax revenue? Can you work that out by now, where the tax revenue is? Well, that's going to be equal to the tax per unit times the number of units. The tax per unit is $1, the number of units is 3.7 billion packets, but we can also just draw that as the rectangle made up of this product. And the deadweight loss, as I mentioned, is this triangle A, B, and C. Let's talk about the opposite of a tax now, which is a subsidy. This is when the government actually provides some money to assist certain groups of consumers or producers. It makes certain goods more affordable for certain groups of consumers. Imagine that we are going to subsidize our producers, for example, which happens in some sort of industries that the government wants to support, for example, our dairy farmers. Well, on the left, we've got the pre-subsidy market with the equilibrium point and a consumer surplus C, a producer surplus of P. On the right, we see what happens when the government imposes a subsidy of $1 per unit. $1 per unit effectively makes the marginal cost $1 cheaper per unit. So that means for every given unit, it's now $1 cheaper to produce, so we can move that supply curve down by $1. As we see here, we've moved the supply curve down by $1. When we do that, we end up at point C. And at point C, the quantity traded is larger with the subsidy than it was before, and the price in the market is lower than it was before. The producer surplus has increased, it's now P prime, and the consumer surplus has increased, it's now C prime. This extra little yellow triangle here and this extra little green triangle here are actually transfers made from the government to the consumer surplus and to the producer surplus. So it's a transfer from the government to consumers and to producers. But this D here, on the other hand, that's actually a loss because the overall area, this quadrangle, is the cost of the subsidy that the government's paying. So it's this width multiplied by this height here. And this area D is a cost that the government's made which has not benefited either the consumers or the producers. So that's going to be a deadweight loss. So the winners of a subsidy policy are the consumers and the producers together because they're getting essentially a transfer from the government. But it costs more to the government overall than the benefits that those producers and consumers get. So a better way of doing things would be if the government instead made a direct lump sum transfer to the poor, whether it be those producers or those consumers that the subsidy was meant to benefit. And there's a nice video in your ebook about this. Okay, so our basic summary then from government intervention is, in these sort of markets anyway, is that perfectly competitive markets converge to those points where the total surplus is maximized. And any government intervention that prevents that market from getting to its equilibrium price and quantity through that market mechanism, that price mechanism, is going to decrease total surplus, which means that we should be trying to avoid government intervention at all costs. And that's the basic economic rationale between that small government, free market ideology of the political right. Now, we will see examples where this logic fails and in fact completely backfires, in that only government intervention can increase the total surplus, which is part of the rationale between the economic left of politics. Public goods are one example of this. But for the moment, we'll continue on with the generic government intervention examples in competitive markets. And now we'll look at it in the international context. So government intervention in international trade. The questions in international trade we want to know are how much to import or export, because suppliers are providing both in their domestic economies and to the world or to other countries. And what happens if the government intervenes by implementing trade policies? These are again the ways that we should frame economic questions, or questions we want economists to answer about policy. What will happen, not what should happen. So when we think about international trade and a model of it, we should think about both the domestic price and the world price. The domestic price is essentially the price that we've been talking about so far. It's that equilibrium price that occurs in the country if there's no international trade allowed. The world price is the equilibrium price when we take into account the international or global market. It's also important for us to think about what sort of economies we're interested in analysing. A small open economy is one that participates in these international markets, but its production or consumption is small enough compared to the rest of the world that its supply or its demand does not affect that world price. Essentially, it's a price taker, similar to an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market. So for example, when it comes to Australia's consumption of headphones, our change in demand doesn't really affect the world price for headphones. We're not big enough to affect that. So it's not going to be the case for something like the US, where it can indeed influence these markets. But for most countries, we will put them in the category of a small open economy. A closed economy is an economy that does not engage in any international trade, which is sometimes also called autarky. So let's imagine that we've got some small open economy, like Australia, or if you think we're too important, we'll say New Zealand, has a certain domestic price in a market and takes the world price PW as given, so that we cannot influence this price. So that means that no seller is going to accept an offer in her country of less than the world price. Well, it's a he here, that he can always sell overseas instead to get that world price. And no buyer is going to be willing to pay more than the world price in her country because she can always buy from the overseas market at PW. Think about, I don't know, buying books from a bookstore here. If you know that on Book Depository or Amazon you can get the same book for $20, you're not going to be willing, including shipping and everything, if it's $20, you're not going to be willing to pay more for the book here. Okay, now we get into slightly more complicated graphs than what we've seen before. So before we make this graph any more confusing than it's going to be, let's just look at the domestic market without any international trade. We've got a demand curve, we've got a supply curve, domestic and domestic. The quantity of rabbits traded per month is 500 and the price is $10 a rabbit. Now imagine that the world price for rabbits is $15. Well, that means that no seller is going to be willing to sell his rabbit in the domestic market for $10 because he can always get a better price somewhere else. So 15 is going to be that price because with trade, in this situation, our sellers are going to export if need be. So if the domestic price is less than the world price, then we are an exporting small open economy for this market. At a price of $15, some of our domestic consumers are still interested in rabbits. You can see it's the ones here with a high willingness to pay. So 200 rabbits will still be traded in the domestic market, but we can see that our sellers, our producers of rabbits, are willing to supply much more than just 200. They're willing to supply 900. Now, where a small economy will consider the world economy to be very big, so we're going to export 700, such that overall supply is 900, and now we're not willing to supply any more at a price of $15. So why do we generally want countries to open up to trade? Well, that area D that we saw in the graph represents gains from trade that we didn't have before. So before, our consumer plus producer surplus was this triangle here, A plus B plus C plus E plus F. But now our consumer plus producer surplus is much, much bigger. The consumer surplus is equal to A, so that's smaller, but the producer surplus has taken up the B and C that was there before for that consumer surplus, plus D. So there has been an increase in surplus, a gain from trade of the size D. I mentioned gains from trade. That can be defined very simply as the capture of that extra surplus available in an open economy compared to when that country is in autarky, or in other words, is a closed economy. Now, where are those gains from trade coming from? Well, it's because of that exporting. So it's coming from the international consumer surplus at the expense of our domestic consumer surplus. So our domestic consumer surplus is going down, our consumers are worse off, but overall our producers' gains more than make up for it. Okay, let's look at the other side now. Let's look at when we are an importing nation. So when will we be an importing nation? Well, that's a situation where the domestic price is larger than the world price. If the domestic price is larger than the world price, we definitely want to be, as a consumer, we definitely want to be buying from the world price where it's cheaper. So again, let's consider the situation without trade. Then the price is equal to that domestic price at $3. And at that point, we're selling 50,000 bananas a month and buying 50,000 bananas. The consumer surplus is equal to A and the producer surplus is equal to B plus E. Now let's open it up to trade with a world price of $2 per banana. At $2 per banana, we still have some domestic sellers who are willing to sell. These are the ones here with a lower willingness to accept. So 20,000 are going to be sold in our domestic market, but our domestic consumers would be willing to buy 70,000 at a price of $2. And they can make up for that domestic shortage through imports of $50,000. Overall, the equilibrium price is equal to the world price, $2. The total amount that our consumers are going to buy is 70,000. The consumer surplus is A plus B plus C plus D. Our producer surplus is only E, but compared to the case before trade, this is an overall gain of area C plus D. So why do we want to open countries up to trade? Well, we can see again simply what these gains from trade are. And where are they coming from? Well, it's at the expense of our domestic producers, but our consumers overall are getting a larger surplus. So these are the basic efficiency and welfare reasons for why it's better to open up for trade. There are some other areas, some other benefits that economists do talk about, which we're not going to go into much in this course, but I would like to mention it to you. And that is that consumers in general like a wider variety to choose from. We want access to a wider variety of products. We don't just want to eat food from our country, we want to eat food from other countries. We get more pleasure and enjoyment from a wider variety of goods. In addition, there can be economies of scale when you've got access to a larger market. Particularly, it might be the case that producers of some raw minerals such as bauxite and copper simply don't have the incentive to open a big mine because they only can take advantage of those economies of scale when they produce a certain amount. And that amount might not match the domestic demand. But when you've got that international demand component as well, you can sell your stuff overseas, then it might be in your interest to actually develop this mine, which increases the industry overall, and as well as the producer gains from exporting, there are also obviously employment gains to our economy. As a nice segue into what we'll talk about in the future, when we don't have a perfectly competitive domestic market for a good, but we actually have some sort of market power, such as a monopoly or an oligopoly, then this international competition can actually reduce that power. So monopolies are generally not good. Things like, for example, the supermarkets, which is a well-known duopoly between Coles and Woolworths. We can see that their market power has been reduced by Aldi coming into our market, for example. And also when you've got different countries that are specializing in different technologies and different production ideas. Opening up to trade helps the flow of those ideas and technologies to happen easier and to happen faster. Okay, I'm going to move on now to tariffs. Now, tariffs and quotas. These topics are quite complicated. I recommend going through the Playconomics videos on this and the chapters quite carefully. The interactive videos are nice because they build things up slowly in a graph, and you can see the method sort of developing in real time. And also try to draw these graphs yourself and work out the changes to the surpluses yourself and see if they match with the answers. So let's start with tariffs. An import tariff represents a tax on an imported good or service, which makes them typically more expensive in the domestic market. You would have heard about tariffs during this trade war that is ongoing between the US and China that Donald Trump initiated. Let's see how this fits with the graphs that we've seen so far on international trade. Well, this is a situation where with free trade, the world price would be $15. We've seen this before. So this point here is not so important. That's what the domestic equilibrium would be in autarky without trade. What we're interested now is comparing free trade, which we've just seen, to a situation in which the government imposes tariffs. So in free trade in this market, and it's an importing market, at the world price is $15. You can see that 2,000 are produced by the domestic suppliers, and in total 7,000 are consumed by domestic producers, so that's 5,000 that are imported. And if we get an idea from our previous graphs about surplus, we can see this massive consumer surplus that comes down to this endpoint K and across to 15, and a little domestic producer surplus as well. Now the government puts in a tariff of $10 per book. The world price stays at $15, and now we're adding in this $10 per book. So the price is going to be the world price plus the tariff equals $25 per book. That's the new world price. At this world price, the domestic producers are much happier. You can see domestic producers will now produce 4,000. Consumers still want a bit more than that at this price because the price is lower than the non-trading equilibrium price, but not as much as before, not the 7,000 that they wanted when the price was $15. It's now only 6,000. So the domestic consumers are going to import this shortfall, but they're only going to import 2,000 now. So what about the overall consumer surplus? Well, the triangle now comes down to the start of the K and goes across. That's the consumer surplus. The producer surplus is this area here. So we've got the I, J, and K that are missing from before with free trade. But the J actually represents the income that goes to the government from the tariffs, because remember, the government is imposing $10 per tariff, so that's the height of the rectangle. And the number of books imported, well, that's the difference between how much the consumers buy overall and how much of that comes from the domestic suppliers. So it's 6,000 minus 4,000 is 2,000, the width of the rectangle. So J is the government tariff revenue, but I and K we can't explain. I and K are the dead weight losses. So overall, domestic consumers lose, domestic producers gain, the government gains, but there are dead weight losses. So dead weight losses say that overall, in terms of the welfare to the economy, the tariff is bad. So what can we say compared to the various scenarios we've considered so far? Well, it's true that compared to a market without imports and tariffs, what we want to do is we want to compare applying tariffs to a market without import and tariffs, which is the closed one, to a market with an import quota or an open one, but not one that is fully open. So what have we seen? Well, we've seen that producers are happier when tariffs are imposed, but it's not as good to them as if the government completely shut off imports. That would be great for domestic producers. What about for consumers? Well, consumers are better off with imports that are tariffed, that have tariffs applied, compared to there not being any imports at all. But they would be much, much better off if the government just completely opened the economy without any tariffs. What about for the government? Well, the government only wins when it gets revenue when comparing these examples, and that's in the case when there are tariffs, because that's a tax on the imports collected, which was area J. So to sum up tariffs then, if we compare it to a situation where there aren't any imports at all, allowing imports but with tariffs lead to a decreased local supply from local producers, a lower P star compared to before the imports were allowed, an increase in consumer surplus, though not as much as in the case where it was open without tariffs, and tax revenue to the government. It is a better situation than having a completely closed economy, but still there's an increased deadweight loss compared to just allowing completely free trade, which is behind the main criticisms of Trump's approach. A quota is something a little bit different. So it represents a quantity limit on the amount of goods or services that are permitted to come in. Now, the quantity demanded domestically might exceed that domestic supply, and then you might limit some imported goods in to allow it to fill that shortage, and that's what a quota is. Let's see another example looking at the book market. Now, excuse me, this example from the book has been purposely chosen to mimic the example we saw before in the case of tariffs so that you can compare the two. So here we look at an example where the government has imposed a restriction on 2,000 units of books per month. And when we put that in place, it means that the supply that the domestic consumers can see is equal to the domestic supply plus a maximum of 2,000 coming from overseas. So we can essentially shift the supply curve to the right by 2,000. When we do that, we find we get to this point here where we've got a quantity of 6,000 and a price of $25. That's made up of 4,000 that are supplied domestically and 2,000 that are imported. Now, like I said, these numbers were chosen to show that both a tariff and a quota can be made in such a way that they lead to the same equilibrium change in price and in quantity, and roughly speaking, the same sort of change to overall welfare, because we'll get the same change to consumer surplus and producer surplus in this example from a $10 tariff or from a 2,000 unit quota. So before the quotas were imposed, again, we had this massive triangle here, which was consumer surplus, and now that's been cut down to just this triangle. And the domestic producer surplus has increased by a lot, just in the case of the tariffs, by area H. I and K, they have disappeared. They are the deadweight loss. But the difference between quotas and tariffs really comes down to what happens to this area J. So before, in the case of tariffs, it was simple to work out that it was government revenue, tariff revenue. But now, this is the bonus that goes to anyone who can buy at the world price of 15 and sell at the domestic price of 25. If they can do that for the 2,000 units, they'll end up with this area J. So it's a bonus to importers. Now, gotta fix this microphone. Now, if governments could perfectly tax that importer bonus, then they could grab that back in terms of importer fees, and we'd end up in the same situation that we had for tariffs. Overall, however, the change to producers and consumers is the same. There's an advantage to being an importer, and there's going to be a deadweight loss. So quotas are similarly bad. There are two other reasons why quotas are considered worse than tariffs that don't fit into this analysis. The first is the incentives for corruption, in that the government chooses who gets to be the importers and who gets to have these bonuses, and some decisions got to be made about allocating those importer rights, and there's the potential for that to be exploited in a corrupt way. The second thing is that when negotiating multi-country trade deals, it's much easier to come up with a consistent percentage tariff to be applied across countries than it is to come up with quota amounts, these numbers that would change from country to country. A final application that we'll look at today is about minimum wages, which is perhaps the most important example of price controls that's studied by economists. So most studies have found that increasing the minimum wage, which is essentially putting in place a price floor in the labour market, also increases unemployment, as would be expected. However, the effect is quite small. There's almost no effect if the minimum wage rate is already low. An example of that is the US. And the effect is actually much bigger in terms of the inefficiency loss if the minimum wage is already very large, say France. So the point is that there are other factors that need to be taken into account when trying to work out the size of the efficiency changes from implementing this sort of price restriction. There are some other things that need to be accounted for as well. So increasing the minimum wage can help employment if the industry has monopsony. Now, monopsony is very similar to when a supplier has monopoly or market power, but in this case we're talking about just having one consumer. So the market's not competitive, but the employers have the market power over the employees. An example would be the labour market in, say, Mount Isa or Gladstone, where there are only one or two large mining companies that have jobs going. In that case, you as a worker, you are the seller, you are selling your work, but you're competing with many other different employees. And the buyer of your labor, these companies, they have the market power. And in those situations, the competitive outcome, the free market outcome, is actually going to be inefficient. So the minimum wage can help to right a wrong. I better get to the last slide before my microphone completely falls over. There are some other arguments for minimum wages that I'll mention because they don't fit into our current models, but I think it's very important. The first is that even if you have this deadweight loss, again, you might consider it to be worth it if you help to balance out inequalities, particularly if the winners of this arrangement are those on struggle street. And it helps those who are in poverty to hopefully pull themselves out of poverty, and having more people out of poverty is going to be better for the economy as a whole, not just for those people themselves. It also provides incentives for the unemployed to actively seek employment rather than just choose welfare if they know that there's a higher minimum wage on offer. And finally, it stimulates innovation, and we'll see that innovation, technology, and productivity are key to growing a country's economy overall. We'll see that in the macroeconomic section. So minimum wages stimulate businesses to invest in technology for automation, for business efficiency, and so forth, as a result of facing these slightly higher input costs in terms of labor. However, there are other arguments to be made about whether or not investing in automation is good or bad for overall employment, and that debate, of course, continues. So that's the end of today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.